Okay, I think we should make a start for this morning. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the SPS Annual Lecture. It's great to see so many people here. One of the advantages of doing the lecture series online is that we get to have a big audience and people from across the UK. It's especially nice to have so many people here to help us celebrate the 20th anniversary of social policy in society. So let me start off with some housekeeping, the exciting bit of the day. The first thing I want to highlight is that we have set up a Padlet where you can record your thoughts about the impact of social policy in society. So you'll see information on the slide and you can add your comments over the course of this morning. I also want to highlight that the session is being recorded and we'll be sharing the recording with you shortly after the event closes. And this will also be updated on the Cambridge University Press YouTube account and also on the journal website. You have all joined in listen-only mode. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the Q&A box. You can send those questions at any time during the meeting. We will address them during the discussion session at the end of the lecture. During the discussion section, if you want, you can also raise your hand to ask a question and a member of the organising team will be able to unmute you to allow you to ask that question. If you have any technical difficulties, please add to the chat box, and again a member of the organising team will try to help you out, or else you can email ameliacollins@cambridge.org. If we experience any major technical issues and have to disconnect, we will attempt to restart the webinar, but fingers crossed it won't come to that. I should have said at the beginning who I was, who I am. I'm Vary Mackenzie. I'm chair of the editorial board for social policy in society, and I'm Professor of Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. But now let me turn to the really exciting part of the day, a lecture from our distinguished guest, Fiona Williams. Fiona is Emeritus Professor of Social Policy at the University of Leeds, where she has been employed for much of her career. She's also Honorary Professor at the Social Policy Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. She has published widely on gender, race and migration in social policy. And her latest book, Social Policy, A Critical and Intersectional Analysis, was published by Polity last year. The book examines what the crises of care, of racial justice and of climate change mean for social policy, especially in the last decade of austerity. Her other publications most recently include Sleepwalking into the Post-Racial, Social Policy and Research-Led Teaching, co-authored with Coretta Phillips in Social Policy and Society, published this year. Fiona is a Fellow of the British Academy, the Academy of the Social Sciences and of the Royal Society for the Arts. She was awarded an OBE in 2004 for services to social policy. Until 2014, she was co-editor of Social Politics, International Studies in Gender, State and Society, and is now Social Sciences Editor for the Journal of the British Academy. Today's lecture is entitled Aligning Arguments for Sustainable Welfare with Care and Racial Justice. And it's my great pleasure to invite Fiona to start her lecture.
Thank you very much, Vary. That was a very kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, hello, everybody. out there. Can't see your names or anything, so no idea who's there. But thank you to Social Policy and Society for inviting me to give this year's lecture. And thank you to the SPS team for facilitating it. It's a great honour, I have to say, especially because the lecture marks 2 anniversaries. It's 80 years since the publication of the Beveridge Report and 20 years since the first issue of Social Policy and Society. So congratulations to Social Policy and Society, a journal whose hallmark is its capacity, especially I think through its themed issues, to publish the latest research and the latest thinking in social policy. And this year's themed issues are no exception. So as I said, this year's themed issues represent, I think, some of the most significant ways in which Beveridge's post-war welfare state and also social policy as a discipline have been challenged. The first one on race and racism addresses the marginalization of racism in the discipline of social policy in terms of both curriculum and minority ethnic representation among staff and students. The issue on long-term care addresses the contradictions between an ethos of personhood, independence, and inclusion, and the realities of low pay, poor working conditions, and institutionalized racism, and the devaluation of the care needs of older people. The themed issue on climate change exemplifies that sustainability is a central issue for social policy, and it focuses on transitions to a non-productivist model for a sustainable welfare state. Yet, in this crisis-ridden world, if we're truly to rise to their challenges, all 3 issues, racial injustice, care, not just long-term care, but care in general, and climate change, demand quite profound recalibrations of welfare states. And this is what I'm going to address. And I'm going to argue 3 things. First of all, I'm going to say that the issue of care and racial justice, like climate change, are crises of global dimensions. They all represent threats to our social sustainability, and they amplify poverty and inequalities. And as such, they jeopardize our mutual solidarity. At the same time, they have all been contested, both through social movements, think of Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion, think of global women's strikes, as well as in local grassroots innovations. These have all generated new thinking and practices, what many call prefigurative practices, practicing in the here and now, what is hoped for the future. And I think it's here that we can begin to look to grasp the issues that should be part of any transformative possibilities for sustainable welfare states. But I'm also going to add to this to say that they are all interconnected, these 3 crises attached to racial, care, and climate justice. Of course, in this way, they all share a common ancestry. All are historically embedded in a capitalism which is colonialist, patriarchal, and extractivist. But applying an intersectional approach here is more than just a theoretical finesse. It helps us unearth that which is hidden or marginalized. And in doing this, it reveals the new contradictions and contestations. Understanding the ways that these crises intersect provides us for a way of seeing both the gaps in social policy thinking across the 3 areas, but importantly, what synergies exist, what synergies for change exist across these 3 areas. And this process is important for thinking about the basis for solidarities and alliances in both thinking and in activism. So in conclusion, I'm going to argue how together these crises give rise to a new set of political ethics which need to underpin a future eco-welfare state. Let me start with the global crisis of care. I argue that there are two dynamics which are interlocked in our current period. The first is the devaluation of care, and this is its long-standing invisibility as women's work, either unpaid or paid, plus its subordination to paid work and to productivism. It's always seen as lesser to those. Also, it's not just about gender, it's also bound up with inequalities of class, race, migration, disability, and age. The second is the depletion of care. That is the failure to provide the resources that give people the capacity to care and to be cared for. Material resources, time, support, space, and so on. This is not only about the effects of changing demographics, but austerity and neoliberal marketizations have intensified this. So let me give you two examples. In the Social Policy and Society special issue on long-term care, they show how in England, a combination of, on the one hand, the mixed funding model, reductions in social expenditure, low pay and poor working conditions, all jeopardize the provision of diverse services of adequate quality. But also, along with ageist discourses, gendered work, and institutional racism, all serve to add to both the devaluation of care and its depletion. We can also see something similar in the operation of universal credit. So research by Kate Anderson at York University on lone mothers shows that the contract that these mothers enter into and the scrutiny that they experience makes them feel that their childcare responsibilities are devalued as a sort of barrier to employment. In other words, their care is devalued, and by being employment ready, their capacity is depleted. Now, both these dynamics of devaluation and depletion were amplified by the pandemic, and I'm going to come back to that. But the crisis of care is also global. First, in terms of the global south, where these dynamics I've been talking about are similar, but they're sharper, with greater reliance on a female wage. They're intensified by unemployment, wars, climate change, and chronic illness. And these place enormous responsibilities on women to care without infrastructural support for the basic amenities. Second, almost half the world's migrant workers are women, many of whom find domestic or care work in households or institutions of high-income countries. And then this creates a set of geopolitical relations of inequality, whereby welfare states or households in higher income countries are able to solve either individually or through the state their expenditure problems by buying in cheaper migrant or domestic labor. While this is a relatively new phenomenon, it reproduces an older condition of colonial extraction in the welfare state. And for example, after the war, the recruitment of health and female care labor from the colonies provided cheap labor for the new institutions of the welfare state, and also met a labor shortage, which otherwise would have had to be filled by British married women. And this was in a period in which women were assumed to have primary responsibilities for their home and children. Both then and today, these workers provide cost-effective ways of securing white family norms and care needs at the sacrifice of their own. Indeed, I'd say that it reiterates an even earlier trope of the racialization of female domestic servitude. Now, in many ways, the COVID pandemic represents a collision of all these three crises, because, to begin with, COVID was a new microbiological form of environmental risk to sustainability. Second, those at greatest risk were in need of care, those in need of care, older people and disabled people. and also those providing care, especially to these people in care homes. But it was also the disproportionately higher mortality of minority ethnic groups on average, which was sort of very startling. I mean, on average, this was 4 times higher than their white counterparts. In 2020, within the NHS, 21% were minority ethnic workers, yet they comprised 63% of all COVID deaths. Now, research in the special issue on long-term care by Shireen Hussain shows that minority ethnic groups and migrant workers in health and social care face institutionalized racism, increased workload and adverse working conditions, increased including harassment and bullying. And as I said, many work with older people and are in the lowest paid and most precarious areas of health and care. So it means, for example, that during the pandemic, they had less negotiating power to ask for better protection or for time off. And amongst the worst affected were migrant workers, many of whom were not initially able to access free healthcare. Now, while the government relented temporarily on this, it also ushered in its post-Brexit restrictions on migrant workers to deny many such workers entry. And this has contributed to a massive shortage of staff in the NHS and social care. But what this collision of crises represents is a deep but fragile contradiction at the heart of racial and patriarchal welfare capitalism, which is between the systematic denial of racial and gender justice and an acute existential dependence on women, minority and ethnic and migrant workers to sustain and repair the world. Now, these patterns of inequality were mirrored geopolitically. Low-income countries suffered much more, not only because they have less health infrastructure, but because less than 10% of low-income country populations have received the vaccine. And this has been exacerbated by vaccine nationalism amongst developed countries and a refusal to confront the corporate interests of vaccine producers. Now, the issues of injustice and inequality raised by the global pandemic felt like a dress rehearsal or a warning for the policy issues facing climate change and environmental degradation. And this collision of crises was well expressed in a speech by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, in 2020. He said that COVID exposed the lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, and the myth that we are all in the same boat. It should be said that many of these issues have not gone uncontested. If you look to social and grassroots movements, some important developments there have been, for example, I'll just mention a few. The ILO Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers, which came from pressure from transnational networks of domestic workers. We can learn from feminist movements in Latin America and the Caribbean who've had some success in framing their claims in terms of the rights to care, to be cared for, and to care for oneself. And, for example, in this country, Kang Logan has been pressing for #StatusNow, the rights of all residents to health care, housing, food, and income. But what I want to talk about is how some of these developments have led to new thinking around care, especially about the revaluation of care, and the development of the ethics of care has been central to this. The idea that care is central to human life and that its ethics, interdependence, and human flourishing are the basis of human action have been very influential. Such ideas challenge Western liberal philosophy, in which rationality, individualism, and autonomy are privileged as central to human action. Care ethics have been applied to democracy, highlighting the values of communication, trust, plurality, and listening. More transformationally has been how to make care and flourishing central to economic and political life. How can we institutionalize an ethic of care? And this requires, on the one hand, developing a caring, democratically run infrastructure which values paid and unpaid care, gives people and communities time, financial and practical support to be able to care or to be cared for. It requires equal access to public space and transport, as well as policies that counter poverty and discrimination. But it also would require a new economic model that challenges the priorities of macroeconomic policies of productivism, market competition, and consumerism, and also the geopolitical inequalities of care. So what I'm saying first is that this crisis threatens sustainability across all regions, and that second, its contestations have given rise to important issues for change, and that it also intersects with the other crises, the second of which I now want to discuss. The global crisis of racial injustice. In contemporary times, the racial crisis combines dehumanizing policies and practices to racialized and migrant groups, but it also combines with colonialism's long and entwined history with capitalism and white supremacy. Over this century, the operation of racial injustice in the UK, indeed in much of Europe, has seen a dramatic sort of dovetailing of racist restrictive border controls with domestic dehumanizing and racializing social policies. This is a global phenomenon in which these practices and controls are carried into national spaces. In the UK, the hostile, now compliant environment impacts both migrants and domestic minority ethnic groups, resulting in degrading and discriminatory practices in the criminal justice system, in health and education. These dynamics are legitimated by an ethno-nationalist and populist policies and assumptions that we're in a post-racial period in which discrimination is exceptional, a prejudice of the past rather than systemic in the present. Now, Akili Mbembe uses the term necropolitics to understand such policies, where the state carries the power to expropriate a group's humanity and at its most extreme, life itself. And what I think this is also about is racist microaggressions and dehumanizing practices in public and private institutions. It's about Grenfell Tower, it's about Windrush, it's about the economic cost-benefit analysis that reduces migrants and minorities to necessary or unnecessary units of labor, a surplus population. This crisis of racial justice also undermines sustainability and human flourishing, and jeopardizes social solidarity. And it too has led to many forms of contestation. Most notably, of course, was the way in which the Black Lives Matter protests went global after the murder of George Floyd by the police in 2020. Black Lives Matter was formed by 3 Black women after other police killings of Black people in the US in 2013. Their focus has been on the dehumanizing policies of the police and prison system. But it was also to open up a profound critique that the concept and the practice of human, which in spite of years of struggle, does not universally include racialized people who are still considered, as Paul Gilroy terms it, infrahuman. This has been a very important space for a radical imagining of new forms of human coexistence and living with plurality by insisting on a discussion of an enactment of the historical and contemporary power and privileges of whiteness. The removal of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol drew attention to the historical colonial formations of racism and racial ordering. In other words, we can't just assume that we can transform from who and where we are now, but we have to reckon with history. And this has been mirrored in the academy with both a concern with the relational aspects within the academy, the lack of minority ethnic staff and students, and the need to develop a decolonial curriculum. The special issue of Race, Racism and Social Policy is a very good example of this development. A number of articles, including my own with Coretta Phillips, look to ways of developing decolonial perspectives. While necropolitics describes the present day, it also refers to the history of environmental degradation, which has been built on genocide, expropriation, and enslavement. And this is reflected in global inequalities that have disproportionately affected people of colour and Indigenous groups. So now I want to focus on the intersections between environment and climate change crisis and the racial justice crisis, and look at some particular gaps. In his book, The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race, Carl Anthony documents the ways in the States in which racial and planetary subordination and racial and environmental injustice go hand in hand over time. This moves from the colonization of both peoples and the earth to the ways in which gentrification, expulsion, and the deregulation of water and waste has hit minority communities. And it's a pattern that's repeated in this country. Environmental racism also is global. The ways in which climate change disproportionately affects poorer regions and countries of the world is clear. The 1.5 reduction target in global warming won't be enough for these regions. And within these populations, women suffer significantly. They constitute the majority of farmers and carers and are more dependent upon land and resources such as water and fuel, which are threatened by climate change. Furthermore, measures to prevent global warming can also cause harm. For example, biofuel production as a replacement for oil has created greater competition for marginal agricultural land and has deprived women, especially Indigenous women, of their livelihoods. Climate change is also behind increases in migration. The UN's Migration Agency noted that in 2018 alone, 17.2 million of new displacements came from disasters in 148 countries and territories. At the same time, there is a strong history of struggle against environmental degradation and ecological damage by communities of colour and Indigenous people. In the US, this started in the late 1970s. As David Naguib-Pello writes in his book about critical environmental justice, the movement, and I quote, fused discourses of public health, civil and human rights, anti-racism, social justice, and ecological sustainability. It articulated a transformative vision of what an environmentally and socially just and sustainable future might look like. Then there's the Buen Vivir, translated as living well, decolonization movement for the environment, which developed in different ways by Indigenous people in Latin America, particularly Ecuador and Bolivia. And thinking here centers on a cosmovision in which people strive to live in harmony with nature. They have not only a commitment to close others, but to nature as well. In terms of new thinking, it's significant to say that many of those decolonial thinkers who expand new ways of understanding humanity, which I mentioned just a moment ago, emphasize that this has to be, as Paul Gilroy says, a new planetary humanism. Again, as Sylvia Wynter, the anti-colonial philosopher, argues, the struggle of people of colour is more than about being against. It's more than about being allowed into present humanness, but it's one of consciously and communally creating a new ecumenical notion of what it means to be human. That is to say, humanism which acknowledges and repairs history and moves towards peaceful coexistence. And she says, in the context of the climate crisis, that this is a praxis that has become much more urgent. In fact, after George Floyd's murder, many activists pointed out that not only could George Floyd not breathe, but the planet itself could not breathe. And in looking to democratic coexistence in common with care ethicists, the point made by those influenced by Buen Vivir is an emphasis on pluriversality, that is, making possible deep dialogue across existing groups, cultures, and cosmovisions, a kind of redistributive justice with a respect for difference and diversity. And the aim is to foster a solidarity and commonality based on respect and understanding of the position of others. Pluriversality is not to deny universalism, but it is also not to assume it either. But it's to develop, again, what Paul Gilroy calls a strategic universalism. So there have been quite a few anti-racist critiques of Western mainstream writing on environmentalism and climate change. And what they point to is the marginalization of these struggles and these forms of knowledge. David Pellow, who I mentioned before, calls for a critical approach in which intersectionality and a multi-scalar approach is one that will focus on the local, the national, and the global, that learns from local prefigurative innovations and works with solidarity with others in its struggles. In a more grounded way, this is illustrated in the way the movement Wretched of the Earth, which is made up, which is an environmental movement, which is made up of, to quote, Indigenous, Black, Brown, and diaspora groups and individuals demanding climate justice. They wrote an open letter to Extinction Rebellion in 2019. And whilst they said they agreed with the main demands of Extinction Rebellion, tell the truth, act now, and go beyond politics, they argue that these are framed by a particular perspective. First, an emphasis on science ignores the generations of knowledge and politics about the earth fostered by Indigenous groups. Second, the stress on the future impact of climate change bypasses the reality that many poor communities both in the global north and south have for decades been suffering from environmental degradation. And third, the strategy of non-violent civil disobedience overlooks the particular vulnerability this poses for minority ethnic groups in confronting the police. Now, with all these ideas in mind, from both the care crisis and from racial justice struggles, let's look more at the third crisis of climate change. If, as I think may be the case, that this crisis offers more traction for transforming the world at this present time, then I want to explore the possibility of synergies across these three crises that could bring together both our analysis as academics, but also activism as well. So let me look at the crisis of climate change and ecology. The integration of climate change into social policy is to be applauded, both for those who have long argued for it, such as Tony Fitzpatrick, and those like Ian Goff and his co-authors in the special issue, who have developed clear frameworks for exploring new questions which are central to sustainable welfare states. And to summarize what some of these new issues are for social policy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I'll go through them anyway. The more that climate change and its policies fall on degraded welfare states, then the more the poorest will suffer. How then can sustainability, adaptation, and mitigation policies be developed in ways and implemented in ways that are socially just and equitable? Secondly, how can social protection, employment, health, and all the services of welfare be developed in a sustainable manner themselves? Thirdly, welfare state development has been dependent on a growth economy. However, the prioritization of productivism and a consumption-based society are inimical to environmental and ecological sustainability. We therefore need a new economic model. Social insurance has been is a system that deals with individual and calculable risk, but the effects of climate change are both unpredictable and can affect large populations. So we need to develop a different approach to security and protection that is geared towards long-term collective solutions that depend on international governments and also solidarity. Fifth, the mitigation and adaptation policies that require multi-scalar forms of cooperation and expenditure from global to local, which profoundly challenge how we think about the relations between the overdeveloped and the developing worlds. And this also presupposes the importance of global governments, but also because many policies deal with sources of planetary instability imply changes in everyday practices, then forms of participatory and dialogic democracy at local level would be essential. So far, so good. The themed issue in social policy and society towards a sustainable welfare state focuses mainly on the third of these issues that I've pointed to, how to develop a post-growth economic model. And in its discussions, the main intersecting theme, which appears in a number of contributions, is aligning care ethics and green politics. So, for example, in the article by Francesca La Rufa and her colleagues, they developed proposals for a green conditional basic income that, to quote, retains a commitment to the principle of reciprocity, but affirms forms of reproductive and ecological labour, care for people, the environment, and social democratic institutions. This synergy between new post-growth economic models proposed to counter climate change and the ethics of care argument to place care and human flourishing at the centre of economic life feature regularly in the wider climate change literature. So, for example, Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, puts flourishing at the center of economic organization in her kind of proposals for a new economics in order to arrive at an ecologically safe and socially just space for all humanity. Tim Jackson further argues that moving away from efficiency and productivity as the objective of paid work creates work that is revalued. It puts value into areas of work such as care and craft work, which are less amenable to increasing productivity. And this would mean that attention to time, therefore, developed a strategy of shorter working hours, which allowed men and women to share unpaid care and community activities. Both in the themed issue on sustainable welfare and more broadly in the social policy related climate change literature, attention is drawn to care as part of gender equality. That literature draws attention to care, but it also, I have to say, draws attention to the geopolitical differences in North-South development. Yet, at the same time, there is a marked lack of reference to racial inequalities, decoloniality, and environmental racism, or to the intersections of care and racial justice, as in COVID, or to a more diverse history of struggles. And this is surprising, since many accounts do acknowledge the Buen Vivir movement as a source of inspiration. It's also surprising when we're talking about social policy, when the challenges to beverage, since the anti-racist critiques on the welfare state, have been around for some 30 or more years. So let me now suggest some further synergies then, which I think can bring these three areas that I've been talking about, these three areas of crisis together. So one is migration. This is mentioned in the climate change literature, usually with references in a slightly hand-wringing way to the role of international organizations such as the UNHCR. But we know that conventions and rights can be set at global level, but ignored by nation states. And I think at the very least that challenging the hostile environment needs to be a principle that social eco-policy takes up, incorporates, along with demands related to current migrants and refugees in the here and now, such as migrants' rights of citizenship, including family reunion, rights to contracts, social protection, anti-discrimination, and so on. And really, there needs to be some discussion of the role of borders in a sustainable welfare state. This leads to the second concept, reparation. There have been some important recent discussions in the climate change literature on reparative justice for climate refugees. And here there are clear synergies with discussions in health and care circles. Migrant care work, for example, forces us to think about issues of reparation to address the depletion of care in migrants' countries of origin and the need for care, the need for social infrastructure. And there are some initial codes of international practice around this already in healthcare, against poaching skilled staff, offering free training and support for migrant workers and so on, but they need to be much stronger and certainly extended to the care economy. But placing these policies under the principle of reparation together raises issues of injustice and potentially brings together the arguments about climate change reparation. Thirdly, there's the concept of extraction. The concept of extraction is central to an understanding of the exploitation of the planet's resources beyond their limits. Now, Naomi Klein makes this connection. She talks of extractivism as a feature of capitalist development, which she likens to populations locked into reservations, locked out of borders, or locked into prisons. Extraction has also become an important concept in our thinking of the welfare state. Earlier, I referred to the recruitment of female health and care workers from the colonies after the war as a condition of colonial extraction. And new research by Gominda Bamra has shown how deeply regressive forms of taxation inflicted upon colonized populations during colonial rule were used to develop the British welfare state from the end of the 19th century onwards. She calls these relations of extraction. There is much to be developed around the synergies of extraction. The next concept is humanism. This is about what it means to be human, and it signals both our plurality and our interdependence. So while care ethics stress human interdependence, in much writing on ecological justice, especially in ecofeminism and when with Vivir, this is extended to a view of a holistic planetary interdependence, and therefore an obligation to consider non-human beings and living organisms. Climate change also invokes intergenerational interdependence, which behoves us to think about the needs of future generations, while decolonial thinking looks to reparation due to past and present generations. And this also overlaps with Paul Gilroy's notion of planetary humanism, not a Western humanism, but one that stretches globally and planetarily. Linked to this are solidarities across differences. One of the key ideas in the social policy and society issue on sustainable welfare states is the development of policies that encourage social solidarity and a participative democracy. But as the perspectives I've outlined on care and racial justice make clear, this also has to recognize and respect difference. Intersectionality is not just a theory, it's a caring democratic practice in which marginalized voices are heard. And a good example of this is the global municipalist movement. This is an ongoing attempt in different cities of the world to make global and local connections by developing solidarities across different groups within cities and also across different cities in different countries. It's called #FearlessCities. They combine feminist, anti-racist and environmental politics, which has involved taking back, in particular cities, control of key environmental resources at city level, water supply and energy, creating a right to housing, to clean air and access to public space, creating a sanctuary city for refugees, addressing gender issues and so on. It's an intersectional movement which depends on developing alliances across these areas. So finally, let me draw this discussion to a conclusion. I've proposed that new thinking in all three areas of care, racial justice, and climate change emphasize the relationality of our being and our interdependence as its living enactment. And this is underpinned by the principle of human flourishing. In doing this, this thinking extends our idea of moral obligations of redistribution, recognition, representation, and reparation far beyond those that underpin the Beveridge report. First, it sees relationships as planetary in terms of our global interdependence. Second, it sees relationships as planetary in terms of between humans and the ecosystem. It extends to non-human beings and living organisms. Third, these interdependencies summon up intergenerational obligations to future generations who will inherit the planet, but at the same time, commitments of reparation to dehumanize racial and other suffering of past generations. And this signifies material and moral obligations towards reparation. All this, I think, demands a more radical and critical understanding of humanism, in which cooperation, coexistence, and solidarity are enacted in respectful and caring democratic dialogue that can balance universality with pluriversality. Thank you very much.
Fiona, thank you so much for a superb and just profoundly thought-provoking presentation. I think just demonstrating so carefully and clearly the deep hyperconnectivity between the three crises that you set out. I'm sure there's going to be much interest in asking questions and making comments, and we'll turn to the Q&A in about 15 minutes. But now's the time to be thinking of your questions, and you can start to put those in the Q&A function. Before we do that, though, I'm really delighted to welcome Fiona Duplo as discussant for today's presentation. Fiona is Senior Lecturer in Social Policy at the University College Cork, where her research interests include Irish social policy and the Irish welfare state, Irish social security policy, economic globalisation and Irish social policy, the impact of the economic crisis on social policy in Ireland. She's co-author with Mairead Considine of Irish Social Policy, A Critical Introduction, and has co-edited key texts such as Defining Events, Power, Resistance and Identity in 21st Century Ireland, and the Irish Welfare State in the 21st Century, Challenges and Change. So the ideal discussant for today's lecture. So Fiona is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll give Fiona number one the chance to respond to that, and then we'll move to the Q&A. Thank you, Fiona.
Okay, so thank you, Vary, and thank you so much to Fiona for such a wonderfully rich and thought-provoking lecture that has, I'm sure, given every one of us so many ideas to think about, and so many ways to think a bit more positively about our contemporary condition and how we can work our way through some of the crises that define our time. So I'm going to concentrate mainly on making some comments about how important the kind of work Fiona is doing in the discipline of social policy and for how we do social policy analysis. And I'm doing this in a broad sense, partly because it's impossible to fully acknowledge the diverse range of ideas and areas of analysis and contestation that Fiona has highlighted in her talk in a short space of time. And I'm sure that other people will pick up on many particular areas of interest when we move into the broader Q&A. But in terms of my broad points, I'm first going to say some general things, and then I've also got some questions for Fiona related in particular to post-growth thinking that is certainly stimulating a lot of my thinking and research at the moment. So I'd like to pick up on some of the ideas she's mentioned there in a little bit more detail with her at the end. But first, some kind of broader thoughts and comments. So my way into this is tied up with encounters with Fiona's work ever since her earliest book, Social Policy, A Critical Introduction, was published. And as Barry said, you know, I'm coming from an Irish social policy context, which has its own very interesting historical and ongoing entanglements with the British welfare state in terms of race, gender, care, and resource inequalities. But in terms of Fiona's book and all of her work, Social Policy, A Critical Introduction quickly became a key text and a key reference point for the study of social policy for me and for many of my colleagues. And in particular, it was hugely helpful in offering an overarching framework, which at that time linked class, gender, and race to how welfare states are designed and how social citizenship is conceived, and to illuminating how the treatment of gender and race within the welfare state has shaped so many inequalities that both extend and move beyond economic inequalities. And I've been struck by how in the intervening period, that kind of overarching analysis has not necessarily gathered pace. It's waxed and waned, with maybe more of the latter and less of the former. And that's not to say that there have been enormously significant areas of growth in the discipline of social policy and conceptual strides made in a number of areas, but it seems to me that social policy as a discipline has lacked that development at a macro or theoretical level and at reimagining the welfare state as a consequence. And that is why Fiona's recent book, Social Policy, A Critical and Intersectional Analysis, is another such important contribution. But to go back to the idea of limited development, I want to touch here briefly on some some of the reasons for that limited development as a way of situating the significance of Fiona's analysis and her aligning of arguments for sustainable welfare with care and racial justice. And the first of these for me have to do with our epistemologies, our ways of knowing, and our criticality in the discipline. And I've been really struck, for example, by something that Nasser Mir wrote a couple of years ago. And he himself was drawing on comments by the decolonial scholar Ramon Grossfugel that social policy still needs, and I'm quoting, to acknowledge the provincialism of foundational epistemic structures before breaking with them to facilitate greater epistemic diversity. And in doing so, go beyond the knowledge produced by the few Western men of 5 countries, that is England, France, Germany, Italy, and the USA, that compose the canon of thought in the humanities and social sciences. And I think the kind of scholarship that Fiona is doing and other like-minded social policy analysts have also been doing certainly draws attention to social policy's provincialisms and is a hugely important resource in decolonizing social policy thinking. And then there are also issues with the nature of the discipline of social policy. So Hartley Dean's image of social policy as a promiscuous magpie comes to mind here for how the discipline sometimes can end up being quite eclectic and drawing on so many other related disciplines that it itself lacks a core identity. So social policy as a discipline perhaps risks becoming something like one of Timothy Morton's hyper objects. That's something that's difficult to grasp in its totality and something which is possible only to comprehend fragments at any one moment in time. And even what you might call mainstream or generalist social policy tends to think and do social policy analysis in very sectional as opposed to intersectional terms. So it's easy to slip into thinking of redistributional issues in a splintered way across key social services on the one hand, whilst issues which are broadly treated as matters of recognition in areas such as gender, race, sexuality, disability, and age just become add-ons existing in silos or in various states of marginality against what is considered the mainstream. So again, for me, that's why contributions that are based on intersectional analysis like Fiona's and that push beyond the binary of mainstream versus marginal are again so important. And that's certainly not an easy thing to do. And it was just a pleasure to listen to Fiona's lecture this morning, for its just ability to bring together so many rich ideas and complex and nuanced areas of analysis together to help us develop a theoretical framework in social policy that's adequate to the task of reflecting the complexity of contemporary social policy and social inequalities at local, national, and global levels. And then another reason why I think Fiona's analysis and the ideas she offers are so important have to do with the issues of contemporary conditions of knowledge production in the neoliberal university, which we're also all disciplined by. So that fosters conditions of knowledge production that probably exacerbate some of the sectional tendencies of social policy, where we're pushed to hyper-specialization, to the commodification of knowledge, and to the production of knowledge as a mode of technocratic evidence for social policy making. And in these contexts, there's a risk that often what starts out as critical or radical thinking becomes co-opted by what Nancy Fraser has termed progressive neoliberalism. But in the UK, perhaps there's not even a risk of progressive neoliberalism. Perhaps the challenge is not so much resisting that as trying to find spaces that go beyond and against what Will Davies has called vengeful neoliberalism and its legacies post-COVID. So in these contexts and conditions, I think it's just hugely important to focus on prefigurative politics and practices, as Fiona has been doing and has given us so many examples in her talk. And they're so important in terms of foregrounding sources of critical thinking and action that are not quite so focused on the state, on neoliberalism, or on austerity capitalism, which of course are the sources of so many of our contemporary crises. But it's so much more important also to focus on forms of knowledge and action that generate sustainable welfare in its most inclusive and integrated sense, which Fiona has given us a glimpse of here. So they're my broad comments on just why I think Fiona's analysis just is so vital and so important. And from that, I mentioned I had some specific kind of thoughts or things I've been pondering on that I'd like Fiona maybe to pick up in a little bit more detail that she's also touched to a degree in her talk. So she's covered a lot of the currents in contemporary post-growth thinking, and she's been rightly critical of some of its blind spots, particularly around racial injustice. And if we kind of maybe narrow it back down to the UK focus in particular, there's been a lot of interest in universal basic income and universal basic services as kind of two of the big ideas of concrete policy proposals that seem to animate debate on reimagining and transforming the welfare state. And I'm wondering, Fiona, what you might say are some of the implications of your thinking of framing intersections of sustainable welfare, care, and racial justice for how we might think about policy proposals in these areas, and in particular, are there reasons to be wary of them? So that's my first question. And the second one is it's kind of the inevitable kind of the politics question in a way, which is just drawing out some of the things you said, maybe in looking at them from a slightly different angle. So I wondered if you might speak a little bit about the tensions between the here and now and what seems politically utopian, or between the real and the possible. And so often critical thinking and radical ideas are hindered, even by those with the most hope, by debate around their political feasibility and lack thereof. And so one of the things I've been thinking about in this context is Andre Gorza's notion of non-reformist reforms. And that is reforms that are possible in the here and now, but whose potential goes beyond the here and now, to have the possibility of more transformative effects of, for example, undermining the fragilities and contradictions of contemporary capitalism rather than shoring them up. And you've already spoken quite a bit about areas of activism and thinking, and you've mentioned some progressive changes around the globe, particularly in the global south. And I'm wondering if they're, maybe bringing it back to the UK, the European context, if there's any particular reforms you might see as having potential as non-reformist reforms. Is it possible to identify any of these in the UK context, or if not, in a broader European context? So they're my two questions, so I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Fiona.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very kind and positive comment on my what I certainly that's certainly what I've been trying to do in my career in social policy, is exactly what you're talking about. And I think, so to come to the, you know, I've been very good at the critique, you know, and at showing the blind spots. But, you know, what would you do in practice? That's often what people say to me. I mean, I've tried to point in a number of ways, both in my talk and in the ways in which not what I would do, but what is happening, I think, is influential for the future. But I think about, say, universal basic income, right? I mean, there's a bit of a kind of either or now in writing between universal basic income or universal basic services, you know, that certainly those who are pushing for universal basic services like Ian Goff and Anna Coote do see this as a bit of an either or. They see the focus on universal basic income as detracting from what would actually give people to go back to my arguments, would give in the depletion of care, give people the capacity to then be on a more equal footing. I think what's difficult about posing this as a binary, I agree with them to some extent. I agree with that position in that I see universal basic income as kind of following an individualized model rather than a collective model. People being given their universal income to do with what they want. And I can imagine that if that was introduced by a neoliberal government, that could well become the rationale, the legitimation to say, you've got your money now, we don't have to give you childcare services, you can now pay for your ears to be syringed, and all of those things because we've given you your basic income. So I can see that, and this is where context matters. It depends on the context in which you introduce universal basic income as to whether it would detract from what I would see as the more important universal basic services. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, the sort of research and the experiential response to where universal basic income, especially in Canada, has been introduced is very positive. By people who have been in poverty, it's a very positive response. And it's also an idea which has gained a lot of traction. It's gained a lot of traction, and in its more kind of sophisticated arguments is something that you can see taking off. And I kind of feel one shouldn't argue against something that has such this sort of popularity, something that is quite radical that has that popularity. But again, context matters. If you were the biggest thing is around gender, of course. Would a universal basic income reinforce gender inequalities? Because women would then have an income, and therefore the arguments within households about who stays at home could be more difficult to, who stays at home to look after the children could be more difficult to overcome. So it's a very complex area, which depends on the political context in which it's being argued, is what I would say. I would also say that when people are arguing for universal, they don't often, on either count, they don't question what universal means. Does it mean all people who live in that country, or is it just citizens? And what does citizenship mean? And this is why I think that whole question around migration and minority ethnic groups and everything is so absolutely crucial to, as I said, I think, don't assume what universalism means. Always have a look at what it means and critique it. Well, of course, social policy scholars do that a lot. That's part of their sort of their job, to look at how this policy doesn't work for these groups, but actually to have an even more critical eye to the question of citizenship and what that means. And of course, as I said, what borders mean, both borders in the kind of metaphorical sense and in the real sense mean. So that's that. The tensions between here and now and what's possible, always a difficult one, with the argument, but that just wouldn't be feasible. I mean, my answer to that is, and by the way, the reference to Andre Gortz, absolutely, yes, non-reformist demands. I mean, I think on the one hand that as an activist, one has to be very, very attuned to where the contradictions are showing the cracks, you know, and therefore, and go in for those. And I mean, I think that's why I said I thought that the climate change as a kind of a movement which will open up a great deal of the contradictions of capitalism is probably, you know, has the best possibility. But I know that, I know from my own experience, you know, from fighting for all sorts of struggles in the 70s, that some of those happened, you know, I mean, women's health centres happened, you know, from running a kind of little backstreet organisation that gave free pregnancy tests to women, you know, actually, you know, within 10 years, health authorities had taken on this and understood. So, I mean, these things do happen, even those prefigurative practices that we were involved, they did. But of course, it's the taking over by local authorities or by boards, you know, health boards or whatever. And what happens then that's absolutely crucial, and how to keep hold of that. And of course, that comes back always to the question of the nature of our democracy and what voice people have. And I think that is always the kind of crucial nub of these things. What voice do people have? And if they don't have it in the formal ways, what ways can they have it informally? So I think, oh, you talked about the Global South as well. Yes, I think that things that are going on, I mean, I mentioned some of the changes in some of the struggles in Latin America over care. You know, it behoves us in a way not to assume that the struggles that go on in this country are not relevant, or in the West are not, sorry, the struggles that go on in the Global South are not relevant to us. They're often beyond us. I mean, I know there's been some important collaborations around poverty, for example, around people in poverty and people in poverty in, I think it was with some African countries. And that is terribly important, you know, because poverty is a global as well as a local thing. So I think in terms of recognizing the global, but also I mentioned about the domestic workers that got together, and that was a transnational organization of people who had come from third world countries often, right? Often found themselves in other countries, but nonetheless, it related back to what was going on in their own countries.
Right. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, both Fionas, for the great commentary and questions and responses to those. We have two questions which have come in. I'm going to start with a question from Jenny Popey, a great question. Fiona, I'm not sure if you're able to see these, but I'm going to read out.
What if I put my glasses on?
Okay, I'll read out the gist of Jenny's question. She starts off by saying what a wonderful presentation it was. She's asking where Urry's dinosaur social class as a continuing access of inequality fits into the tripartite crises that you have set out for us, particularly experiences and perspectives of disadvantaged white working classes globally.
All right. Okay. Let me just turn that off. Well, thanks, Jenny. Nice to hear from you. I think I would start by saying that yes, class is obviously very important, and in the lecture I've given, which is a bit different from the analysis I give in my book. I do say I haven't talked a lot, for example, about precarious work or those sorts of issues that are very important to class inequalities. But in a bigger analysis, I would include that in my framework. However, I don't think it's helpful to use the phrase the white working class, even the disadvantaged white working class, simply because to talk about the white working class and their disadvantages is to is to understand them as through their whiteness being particularly disadvantaged from something that they might otherwise have expected. That's what worries me about that use of white in that situation, that it somehow implies, and I'm sure you're not implying this, but it's the way it's been used about the North and the disadvantaged white working class of the North of England, has been to suggest that there is something specific about their whiteness that assumes that they shouldn't be disadvantaged, when in fact that disadvantage covers the working class, and that working class is one that includes race. So it is, in a sense, to exclude race from or to exclude minority groups from a notion of class. And because one of the whole difficulties around the application of class has been to see it, to exclude the specific experiences of the intersection of race with class, I think it's not helpful to talk about a disadvantaged white working class. I think it is very helpful to talk about disadvantaged communities, which may be made up of people from all sorts of different ethnic groups, rather than just to talk about the white working class. So that's, I mean, it's a complicated issue, but also I feel that this notion of white working class is used almost like a trump card, forgive the pun, in which there is, well, to repeat the points that I made, that there is something really wrong about this, right? It's like we know that a lot of boys don't do well in education, but sometimes that argument is, oh, there's something really wrong with this when boys aren't doing so well, as if, they had a right as boys. And it's this notion as if white working class people have a right as white people, but whereas actually they have a right as part of the working class to better conditions. I hope that, I'm sure there are other people here who can make that comment in a more eloquent way. So, right.
Thank you, Fiona. It was very eloquent. The second question is from Nasar Mir, and he also says, thank you for your lecture. And he is asking if you can elaborate on what justice means in your argument. Specifically, do you think that normative social welfare approaches need to give up on distributive justice for something else, for example, corrective justice, in order to rectify injustices that have already occurred? And if so, how can we avoid a hierarchy of this corrective justice, for example, in the way that Black feminists critique the laundering of race in the mainstreaming of intersectionality?
Oh, that's a good question as well. That's a really good question. And I have to say, Nasar, that it worried me throughout writing this lecture that I thought, I really need to say what I mean by justice. I really need to say what's the difference between social justice but what I think I was coming to at the end of my talk was what Charles Mills calls corrective justice, that reparative justice has to now be seen as part of social justice. I think that and economic justice, that it has to be included in there. But of course, as soon as you begin that, because I also think that reparative justice, I mean, we could, for example, include disabled people in that, because the history of treatment of disabled people is just as appalling. I mean, in terms of the notion of infrahuman, that has applied to disabled people as well. So, but because that's not a kind of a generational thing, how do we ensure that disabled people have some form of reparative justice or corrective justice in terms of their past? So I do think that yes, that possibility that just as yes, that move to intersectionality has also become a kind of a way of not focusing on the real specifics, the specificity of the treatment, the dehumanization of Black people. I do feel that has happened to some extent, but how you avoid it, I mean, again, it was a big issue with equal opportunities in the 1980s and 90s, that suddenly equal opportunities became a hierarchy of different ways in which different groups would then assume their greater sort of elevation in the hierarchy. But in a way, I also think that that's why intersectionality as a political form of practice is so important, because it's at that point that, I mean, if some of the work that's been around various groups that have committed, usually feminist groups that have, I think it's Sisters Uncut, have committed to intersectional practice of very kind of reassuring in terms of how those hierarchies don't get put. And although they're difficult in terms of some people having to acknowledge their privileges, they're also, I think, very important. I think that the difficulty is that some of the things I'm talking about require urgent political practice, and intersectional dialogic democratic practices actually take quite a long time. And I think that that's one of the difficulties, and that's why you end up with these hierarchies, because people haven't kind of sat down and worked it out. But I do think that the intersectional political practices that exist are a good model for how to avoid that.
Thank you for that. So we've got two questions have been sneaked in by Robert Moore. So the first of those is asking you about the extent to which being human is a contested notion, and so what does it mean in different political and cultural contexts? And then the second question from Robert is the question about where to begin, and a comment around that starting small at the local level perhaps doesn't seem adequate to the challenge that you've set out for us.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yes, I mean, it's true. I didn't look at, and interestingly, when I was writing that about what it means to be human, I mean, there are a lot of competing ideas, and obviously the argument around abortion in the States is one very good example of a competing idea of who should be included in humanity. I mean, I can only say that these, I saw there was something that you said about China, was it, in your message? And yes, I mean, these things have to be struggled through, don't they? And I can see that the danger of opening up this question of, you know, where do our mutual obligations lie, and opening it up to kind of non-human and so on and so forth, means that you open it up to all sorts of different arguments. But that's a risk we have to take, isn't it? And those are arguments that we have to have with the evangelical Christian movement, you know, that sort of essentialist Christianity. And those, I mean, people who are Christians are having those arguments within their own within their own groups and organizations. But yes, I mean, you're right to point that out, I have to say, and maybe that, but what I'm saying in a way is that argument around a radical and critical humanism, which is where I would lay my my argument, is one that is, I mean, Hartley Dean has written some interesting stuff on this in social policy. The guy who's written Manifesto for Critical Humanism, Ken Plummer, has also written some very interesting stuff. So I think that the arguments around what humanism means, and of course, you know, people like Paul Gilroy, who I think is now working on this development of planetary humanism, I think that these are all very important, and we need a lot more work on that. And secondly, where to start? Well, it's being started, isn't it? I mean, for example, I gave that example of it wasn't an argument, it was a debate between the Wretched of the Earth and Extinction Rebellion, and the Wretched of the Earth representing different groups. And they actually had all sorts of different groups sign up to their letter. Lesbian, gay, bisexual groups, and so on and so forth. And I think that those sorts of interventions and those sorts of developments are absolutely key. And they come out often of local movements, but they are national and international movements, but they are having these debates. And I think that that's crucial. I hope that begins to answer your question.
A question connected to that final point from Ruby Fiona. So Ruby is asking how confident we should be or can be that the international community can work together to resolve the three interconnected crises. And then in addition, should we be thinking of a fourth crisis in relation to global order disorder?
Yes. Gosh, yes. That's it. That's it. I hadn't thought of that sort of global disorder as something. I'd have to think about that more. But yes, I mean, oh goodness, I think for global governance at the moment around, I have to say, around migration, I mean, it's not very good, you know. It's not something, you know, it's more like sort of management of refugees rather than facilitation of what refugees need. And I think, I mean, Rian Mahan has written some very interesting stuff on on the international organizations and how far some organizations, she says that we shouldn't regard the international organizations, the UN and everything else, as a homogeneous group, because there are some that are much more in touch with not local, but with social movements and are being pushed by social movements, and others that are much more kind of going along with IMF World Bank views, right? So I think it's a struggle around global governance, as it is around anything at the moment. And I think that we have to argue within those. I mean, I quoted in my lecture that quote from the UN Registrar General, which I thought was an excellent quote, and I thought was so interesting if you compare it with, say, the development of the UN's SDGs, what do they call Sustainable Development Goals, right? Because they were formed in 2015, and there has been a long struggle that they didn't mention anything to do with racial discrimination, racial injustice. And there has been a lot of struggle, both within the UN and from outside the UN, saying these goals have got to mention this, right? And I thought it was part of the reason I looked at that was I thought it was very significant that he had mentioned that as one of the things, that idea of a post-racial society, as one of the things that was a kind of a warning. So I think that some of these things are moving, and there's a lot of work being done, by organisations within country to put pressure on international organisations to go the right way. I just want to look at your question again to see whether I've answered it enough. Oh yes, you put about growing tensions, Fiona. Yes, question of disorder. I mean, I'm not sure as a concept in itself whether it's going to be resolved around that, but certainly it's worrying. That's all I can say. It's very worrying, given the greater effects that the war is having on energy resources and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's very worrying. I haven't got an answer for it at the moment.
We have a question from Mary Mosoyani, and Mary's doing her PhD at the moment, and I think is expressing a frustration that the same arguments have been had for a very long time. So I think it's probably not a question. I think it's a rhetorical question. She ends by saying, are we winning or failing because these conversations and research into these areas has gone on for long periods?
Yes. Yes. Oh, and she also has, when does, I have to go back to the pre-revolutionary meaning around humanity. Where does it end? Yeah. Should we, oh gosh, yes. Well, I understand your despair, but I mean, I'm not going to assume things, but I think I may have been around these arguments for longer than you. And, you know, they go through waves, and it depends on the political context in which these things come up. So you can be arguing, as I was doing in the 1980s, for the importance of looking at racism in social policy, and then it disappears out of sight, and it disappears out of sight because of all sorts of political things that are going on, and the discourse, the political discourse that begins to see this at this level. I mean, I think within social policy as well, we have a particular vulnerability. I know that Fiona, the other Fiona, was talking about social policies, the difficulties around social policy. I think one of our difficulties is that we're very dependent on government money for funding our research, and on government, and often the money that comes up is within a particular discourse, and it's quite difficult to escape that discourse, and to want to look at something else. And so you have to twist and turn and work out how you can answer the questions which you think are really important, but use whatever notions of equality or whatever are coming up at that moment in time. So I think partly, I don't think we should despair. I think that the situations in which we find ourselves now are so urgent that we have to have hope. And I think that hope is extremely important. And as scholars, it's the old Gramsci quote, isn't it? That one has to have intellectual pessimism, but optimism of the will. And I think that's precisely what we have to balance at the moment. So in answer to your question, I think optimism of the will is extremely important.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Just Alessio.
Yes, if I may, Valerie, thank you. I don't seem to be able to type a question myself because I'm part of the panel, but thank you so much, Fiona. This has been so thought-provoking, and it's been, really a fascinating conversation. I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more about what you think about citizenship and the role that citizenship plays in all this. I really appreciated what you were saying before about that in relation to ideas of universalism and universal services, for example. But more broadly speaking, to what extent do you think that some kind of the new model that you are kind of envisaging also requires to rethink or go beyond current understandings of citizenship?
Yeah. Yes, I think it does. When I talk about, we have to have a discussion about borders, really, I'm talking about, what are our notions of citizenship? And also, we have to keep on remembering that our notions of citizenship are only about, as they are at the moment, are only about 100 years old. They're not very old. There are sort of older ways of responding to people as simply residents in a country or whatever that would be much more important than that notion of citizenship that developed at the beginning of the 20th century, which was around the nation state. So I think it summons up a whole debate around the nation state and what is the nation state. And that debate goes on, of course, in politics. But the question of how the nation state relates to nationalism and what that nationalism has built on is extremely important. Funnily enough, people often ask me about citizenship, and it's a concept. I have written about citizenship, but it's a concept that I haven't used a lot, even though some of my best friends have written wonderful books on citizenship, or the people I most admire have written wonderful books on citizenship. And it's always because I find myself caught up in a kind of particular historical notion of citizenship, and I have to keep explaining that is, to use the current normative ideas of citizenship, one has to kind of strip it back so much that I find in the end that it's difficult to use. But what I'm saying is that I think that some of the ideas around humanism, for example, radical humanism, and the radical and critical humanism, as I called it, really are beginning to kind of put the concept of citizenship as a normative thing into the shade a bit, right? So what it means to be a citizen is a different question. And I think that that's the one that we should be asking. What is the contribution that we require that gives you citizenship according to, you know, what you're able to do? And that I find much more interesting than the notion of citizenship itself. I don't know whether it's just me and other people might feel the same, but anyway, that's my answer.
Fiona, I'm going to squeeze in a quick final question, and it's about communication of ideas. So you have presented so beautifully very complex notions today, but how hopeful are you in thinking about modern media? How do you, in soundbite society, how do we get the complexity of these connections into the frame more successfully?
Yes. That's a good question, and it's certainly one that I worry about, that all complexity it seems at times as though all complexity has been sort of lost in debates that go on. But then, on the other hand, you know, when Black Lives Matter happened, I thought that the discussions that gave rise to about, and when there was the Bristol, you know, the statue, throwing into the river of the statue, I thought that people's openness to complexity at that point in time was so much more heartening than the kind of social media stuff. So in a way, I kind of think that people are bilingual in this way, you know, that they can operate in that social media way of you know, having sort of clear judgments on things, but then they can also operate on a different level when the situation arises. So, and that's the contradiction of humanity in a way, isn't it? That people are very contradictory and they work in contradictory ways, and it's a question of finding the opportunities to get people to be open to those at the right times. I mean, it's all about timing, isn't it? And you know, are people able to say and read or listen to different ideas and new ideas? But yeah, and you know, if you look at some of the kind of popular dramas on telly, it's always very interesting that the most popular dramas are those which present complexity. I find that very reassuring as well. And the most popular documentaries are those that present complexity. And that, in a way, I also think is reassuring. So whilst, you know, you can people will watch one program that's kind of just reinforcing, you know, stereotypes and things, they actually can watch another program which challenges that. So it's about the complexity of people as well, and their contradict, and never to underestimate people's contradictoriness, and not to judge them for it.
Thanks very much, Fiona. I'm going to pass in a minute to Alessio, but before I do that, I just want to give a huge thanks to Fiona and to Fiona for such a stimulating session today. There is a question which has come in, and I'm going to read it out, but I'm not going to ask for an answer, Fiona. And this question just highlights for me how our appetites have been whetted. So John Eversley says, "What next, Fiona W?" So yes, a huge thanks, and I'm not sure if we can all do our little claps, but if not, I'm sure you know that we're clapping even if you can't see or hear. Okay, Alessio, just over to you now.
Yes, thank you, Valerie, and I'm conscious of the time. So, but we just wanted to use this very last few minutes. Well, first of all, once again, to thank you, Fiona, so much for accepting our invitation to deliver the Social Policy Society Annual Lecture this year, and to Fiona Duclo for being the discussant. It's been really amazing, and it's so great to have had such a wonderful and thought-provoking discussion this particular year, because this year also marks the 20th anniversary of our journal, as Fiona mentioned at the start. So we wanted to ensure that this kind of was highlighted today. For those who joined earlier on, you may have seen a slide where we can say that we've created a Padlet wall, an electronic wall. I'm sharing the link with everyone again in the chat. Look at it think about it as a big whiteboard, and some people have started posting some messages there, but we really appreciate anyone going there and adding a little virtual post-it with their comments or experiences of working with or reading the journal, or even, I would say at this point, comments about this lecture and the extent to which the journal can also be more than a journal, but also a forum for discussions about some of these important challenges we heard about before. So please click on that link if you have a chance. Are going all shameless advertising now, and I'm also sharing the web link of the journal, because among the various things you can find some of the theme sections that Fiona was mentioning in her presentation, some of which are open access, so you can have a look at that as well. And as Ruby and I have posted in the Padlet wall itself, we are really proud and humbled to be editing this journal at this point in time. But of course, as they say, we really stand on the shoulders of giants. So if there's anything good about the editorship of the journal right now, it's only because of those who came before us and all the work that has been done over the years. And also thank you to the support of our amazing editorial board, which is chaired by Valerie, and the support of our editorial officer, Colleen, who's there in the background, but it's always so precious in her help. And finally, I'd like to thank Cambridge University Press for kind of hosting the event, both kind of formally and also in practice through Amelia, who's been dealing with the technical things. And yes, again, it's been 20 years. I think just from the discussion of today, we've got at least ideas for another 20 years of discussions and research and publications. And I think the spirit of the journal was very much captured by the conversation today, because it's really about looking at the micro and global level and the interconnections between these two. It's something we increasingly try to push in the articles, and again, it was captured so amazingly by Fiona's today. So again, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Alessio. We're actually finishing 3 minutes early. So yes, just thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today and for asking such great questions also of Fiona.